Okay then.
Okay, so welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And just a little bit about me. I live in Kent. I'm the General Secretary of the Disabled Photographer Society. I'm a lecturer and judge for the Kent County Photographic Association. And I have just a few little letters after my name, but that isn't really that important. The main thing is I enjoy photography, and I think it's such a wonderful hobby that, wherever you go, there's a photograph to be taken. But during COVID, we couldn't go anywhere, did we? And I always think you've got to have a good project in mind. And I decided that after I'd been through sorting out my images, I found some that I thought looked a bit painterly in some way. And so I started thinking about creating photographs in the style of different famous artists and various sort of photographic, or rather art styles, the isms of expressionism and impressionism and all of that sort of thing. And of course, not all of those styles are really particularly lend themselves to photography. I mean, if you think about Picasso, his sort of cubist style maybe isn't the sort of thing you could replicate within photography, but you might come across some of his work in a gallery, and you might use it alongside humans to sort of have juxtapositions and so on. So without any more ado, let's sort of take you through and into the first bit of the story, which is that early period called Romanticism, the Edgar Allan Poe, the Raven, and all of those sort of styles of the mid and early 19th century. And quite often you would find that, images in that period were quite moody, and they had quite strong religious sort of elements within them, and a couple of styles here from Caspar David Friedrich, actually. And so I was then thinking within my own photography, could I create moody and sort of photographs that had those sort of elements within them. So, the spire of to sort of inspire the religiousness of the period, because the Victorians were very into, church going and such like. And then the drama of the cloudscape and so on. And these three little birds that occasionally pop up, because I found the three of them floating around somewhere in Tallinn, Estonia, and I thought they made quite a nice little sort of arrangement. So I occasionally use them in photos. And I have to say, quite a lot of the images tonight, you'll find, you say, well, what on earth he's Eon, for instance, because I do use quite a bit of manipulation and montaging and so on. But, see what you think as we go through. So, this is another little example of what you might call sort of the romantic style, in that we got the young lady there with the veil, and then she's within a sort of religious setting, which is actually Chichester Cathedral. And I had this photograph of a carving of a monk, which I felt this photograph needed a second element. And so I quite often find that, when you're looking at a stronger image, the stronger ones quite often have a really good, interesting focal point, but then something there's a sort of subsidiary and backing up. And that was what the intention of the figure in the doorway is. Another little thing about when you're combining photographs, just as a sort of a matter of interest, it's quite often a good idea to have some sort of layer that is a sort of a blending layer, as it were. It sort of merges the things together so that they all pick up the same graininess, or in this case, a little bit of a reflection from a woodland pool. And then occasionally, you would sort of put together little elements. This is called, I also feel that titles are really important in photography. Your prints and your PDIs need to sort of give the judge a little bit of a clue. This one's called Victorian Gothic, and it's just a combination of three little elements. The sort of pre-Raphaelite figure, a Burne-Jones style, top left-hand corner, and then the slightly distorted hand holding the sword, and then it's Wells Cathedral in the background there. But that's had a little bit of a sort of an oil paint effect, as well as the naturalistic view of the figure. And another one, I mentioned the Raven a little bit earlier on, and these rocks, I think they might have been at Brimham Rocks in Yorkshire, but the buildings in the background, they're somewhere in Normandy. But again, just looking to create something a little different and sort of in the style of that particular theme. There's that same character. I shouldn't really be using him more than once, should I, really? But it's just to give you a sense of how these photographs are put together, because actually this photo is a mixture of intentional camera movement and multiple exposure. And so you get this sort of really weird and sort of otherworldly effect with the intentional camera movement, but then also with the multiple exposures, you bring in more than one element. So we've got the lily pads at the bottom there, but then we've got this forest-like area to the top of the photograph. So my first artist of the evening, David Caspar Friedrich, and here's 3 or 4 examples of his work. And so when I was thinking about how to sort of replicate their styles, I was looking at the sort of repetitive sort of motifs, shall we say. So it was quite often it'd be a wintry scene. It might have a sunset. It certainly generally had a figure looking in the away from you in some way, in some sort of an anonymous way. And there was always some sort of religious iconography within it. And so I then started to come up with images in the style of David Friedrich. And this is my first one, I suppose, and it's called The Girl Looking at the Tower. There's those 3 birds again, and the tower's somewhere in the Midlands somewhere, and I put it into that mistiness, so it's coming out of that. And then, of course, the rocks with the girl standing on it are sort of in the style of that Friedrich style, shall we say. And similarly, this one actually as well, in that that building in the distance, the figure in the middle ground there, and the mistiness all around it. It's cold and wintry, and then you've got the angel is the sort of as the religious sort of element within it, shall we say. And on this one, I like the title of this one. This is called Searching for Heathcliff, or Looking for Heathcliff. And it's a montage, but it's one that I think works quite well, because you get the impression of the girl. I've shifted her quite off to the side of the picture so that there's a lot of room for her to look into, and for you, the viewer, to look into. And then, again, the idea of the church in the distance there and the moorland scene. This particular photograph was taken in the Trough of Bowland. Well, the landscape was, and then the other elements have been added to it to sort of create the story. And, it's the story that often sort of holds a photograph together. This is called The Mourner, and you might recognise the foreground. It's Whitby Abbey, and they've got these wonderful gravestones in Whitby Abbey with all the grasses growing up all around them, and the blackened nature of these gravestones gives them quite a dramatic looking feel. So, it's one of these pictures, it stood alone just with gravestones on their own, but then to add those little other elements into the picture, for me, was, the bit that just lifted it, shall we say. And I just like the fact that you've got these little hints of the further landscape just coming through the clouds and in the distance there. I mean, I've done sort of a split tone, dual tone, shall we say, on this, but I think actually that probably weakens it slightly. I think a monochrome would probably be just as effective, shall we say. And talking about the birds and the raven and the idea of these sort of rather gothic noir type pictures. Here we have the single bird on the right hand side, and flipped and reduced in size, and then that skeletal tree. And if you want to know where that came from, actually that was on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square. About 10 years ago, and it had this really quite graphic look, and so then I've sort of combined the elements to give us this sort of feel for what you might call the Caspar David Friedrich. So what we got here is the same sort of thing, really, and I'm going to just show you now the build-up of how this photograph might be put together. So here, for instance, we've got the cross coming out of the mist in the distance. We've got the skeletal trees, the wintry feel, and the sort of sunburst of light. But it didn't start like that. This is how it started. And this is in the Weald of Kent. And I'm using a telephoto lens shooting through the skeletal trees to the late evening sun, and creating just what, looks pretty good. I quite like it as a standalone image. But the next step was to add a little bit of tone and texture into the sky. So that previous picture was a little bit bland and flat, and so I'm wanting this to have a little bit more, just a little bit hint of tone and texture, shall we say. So it's a little bit of a cloudscape has been placed into that area, and because I'm using a different blend mode, I think it was probably darken. The darken blend mode means that the blacks don't get affected by your inclusion of these mid-grey tones. And then I add in this little bit at the bottom there, you see, and then I add a yellow tone across the whole picture. to get to the next stage. And then of course, the final bit is to add that little bit of a sunburst coming into the image to finish it off. Well, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I quite enjoy the process as much as anything. And, it's one of these things that, if it suits you, have a go at it. But, there we go. So moving on from that romanticism, because there's quite a lot to get through tonight, we come on to Impressionism. And of course, the preeminent, figure in Impressionism is Claude Monet. And here we have a picture of the water lily, the ponds at Giverny. And I did actually visit Giverny a few years ago with my wife, and we went in there, and sure enough, there are the lily pads, and there is the little Chinese bridge, and all of these sort of willows are hanging down, and the pictures can be taken. I mean, this isn't necessarily the style of this isn't a Monet perhaps, but it is impressionistic, because I've used the dry brush effect from Photoshop on this occasion to create this sort of limited detail. So, basically it's patches of colour and so on that sort of create that sort of strange impressionistic effect. And this is another in-camera way of creating impressionism. And this is intentional camera movement. So essentially I'm photographing and lifting the camera as I'm moving it. So these skeletal trees become an impression of the trees rather than the trees themselves. Or on this occasion, at last we've come to a straight shot, everybody. There's no manipulation involved in this particular picture, because I saw this reflection of this little woodland scene with the little reeds at the side, photographed it, and now what I've done here is I've turned it upside down. So it looks a bit like reality, but all of the little sort of impressionistic sort of ripples are just the water. So I've got the reflection here, and I've turned it upside down to get the feeling of impressionism. So, you don't have to use all Photoshop to get your impressionistic styles. You might use multiple exposures or intentional camera movement, or find reflections in windows and doors, and it's surprising what's there to be photographed. So here he is, Monet, and these are the things that you perhaps associate with Monet. And I mentioned that I'd been to Giverny. And here it is. This is the first of my Monets, as it were. And so what have I done? Well, actually, I've used the spatter tool on this particular photograph. So it's created that sort of very sort of impressionistic feel that we sort of tend to expect from him. But I've also boosted up the colour saturation as well. So you can see the lily pads and the lovely colours and reflections in the water. You see the willows hanging down. It is exactly as you expect to see if you've ever been to Giverny, or as you see in his paintings. So that was my first one in the style of, and here's a second one which had a slightly different sort of effect. It's got that watery. It's a double exposure, or rather like the old slide sandwich where you put two pictures together to get a third image, as you do in AVs and things like that. And so we've got a bit of a watery background to this, but also the poppies in the foreground. The thing about poppies and red is, as a matter of the way that light is seen, I think, that reds don't register very well on film or on in digital. They don't seem to provide the same sort of textures that you would expect. So what I've had to do here to sort of delineate the poppy is to use a little line edge, a little black line effect, to create that little bit of detail in the reds, which were a little bit blocked out in parts. And another one where you got a little bit of a oil paint effect on lavender, and again you get and we're almost moving into Van Gogh, aren't we, with this one actually? But it's I still think this is impressionistic enough to stay in the Monet section. But I just include this one as a modern day impressionism. Here's what I call selfie on 42nd Street. So there's me in the just off centre with my wife, my guardian beside me, and I'd seen this polished steel, and it was giving this really interesting distorted effects on the area behind that was in 42nd Street by Grand Central Station in New York. And so I just felt that there were so many possibilities with this, and I've got 2 or 3 versions of this where I'm not in it, where you've got people walking by and you've got distortions of taxis and things like that. It's really fascinating if you can find a reflection in a window, or on this occasion, as I say, a bit of polished steel. But sometimes you just see something that works, and you might wonder, how on earth is this put together? Well, actually, I photographed a bit of wood. And all of the ripples that are, wave-like are actually the grain of the wood. And then I've added to it another photograph and given it a poster edge effect. And on this next one, it's got a slight ripple effect, basically the same photograph, but just manipulated a little bit into the ripple. But the strange thing is all of those lines of water, the waves moving across the scene there, are in fact a piece of wood. It's the grain of the wood. And that was my starting point. It's fascinating. As I say, there's a photograph everywhere if you're looking for it. So here, that same sort of feeling of impressionism. You remember that scene, don't you? That was before the girl and the building was put in. But that's using smudge tool. So again, you create your own little sort of feeling for impressionism with using different effects, and that's the smudge tool. And this is another bit of that intentional camera movement. So I'm standing in front of a little stream with the trees in the distance there, moving the camera at the time of taking. And it's a real hit and miss shot. So I might at this time have taken 10 images using slightly shorter or longer, shutter speeds. But also, as you're moving the camera, sometimes you don't get the right bit, looking as you want it. So it's a wonderful thing about the back of these cameras. When you were working with film, well, for goodness sake, you had to wait 3 weeks before you knew whether you got a decent picture or not. But now you can just look on the back of the camera, review the scene, and have another go. And just as I did with that little woodland pond, so we have here at the Broughton Sands, I think it was called, down in Devon. And these reflections at the bottom, which are quite, I think, impressionistic, are actually beach huts. And because I've restricted just it to the reflection, so you get the feeling of the impression. Similarly here, this little woodland pool, very impressionistic because of the ripples in the water and the way the wind was blowing across the water to create that slightly feeling of movement. So you might have heard of Impressionism, but have you heard of Pointillism? Well, Pointillism is lots of dots in a picture. This picture is taken from Photoshop using the pointillistic style just to show you what Photoshop will do to help you along in creating these sorts of pictures. And here's another one with pointillism in it, but it's a straight shot because the lady is there. I put her in because I thought she sort of had echoes of the same colours in the background, the way she's standing, a little bit like the way the figures are standing. But those figures in the background there, on this mural in New York, in Manhattan, have that same sort of, as I say, pointillistic style that is found by this chap, Georges Seurat. And Seurat was the preeminent, as Monet was in Impressionism, so he was in Pointillism. And here is just 1 or 2 examples from the internet I've placed there just for you to get a feel for the sorts of things that he did and the style of this dotty sort of work. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how he could, say, for instance, his bottom right-hand corner there, he'd go up and put a dot on the picture, on the frame, and then he'd have to walk back about 5 or 10 yards, wouldn't he, to be able to see what sort of effect it would have, because you wouldn't be able to tell being straight up close to it. So it must have been really quite a difficult art to sort of master, really, I suppose. So here's my pointillistic style in the style of Georges Seurat. And this is a little village called Ewley. It's near Gloucester. And looking across the valley, you see the church in the distance. And again, I've overlaid the sort of pointillistic effect, and then different blend modes help you to sort of bring the reality of the real scene back out from it, And similarly here, these dahlias were in Avebury Manor Garden. And probably not far from you, Avebury, is it? I don't know, but probably about 20 or 30 miles south of you, I imagine. And the gardens there are lovely, and this kitchen garden was full of these lovely dahlias, and so again, that's had that sort of pointillistic style. So after pointillism and Monet Impressionism, you had the Post-Impressionists, and they really had very vivid colours. They didn't have quite such a sort of blurriness to their pictures. There was a little bit more detailed, and so examples like that. Here we are. Here's Cézanne. And you can see the sort of thing. It's still got that sort of impression of the place, but it's a bit more realistic in a sense. It's not quite so full of dots and blurs and but he does create strong graphic lines and quite interesting colours. So here, for instance, though, is my visit to the Tate Modern not so long ago, and there was a Cézanne exhibition at Tate Modern. So we went along, and there was one of his most famous paintings in the background there. But then this young lady came and stood in front, and so then what I thought was, I've got a really sharp version of her, but I've got this slightly muted version, which I felt mixed in with the style of the artwork, really. And of course, the colour of her hair and the dress she's wearing, I was really very lucky, because in a sense, it could have been someone less suitable for the photo, really. But the interesting thing, everywhere you go, they've got a phone in their hand, haven't they? And on the left-hand side, I thought about cloning it out, but see how a hand, a thumb and finger is holding a phone, and I did think whether to clone it out, because it sort of slightly spoilt the line of her body on that side, but it's the day, isn't it? People have phones in their hand all the time. So how do I do that? How do you create the sort of a Cézanne-like feel to a photograph? Well, there's a starting point, just like we had a little earlier on with the woodland scene. So I've got this photograph, and it's a black and white negative. But I want colour, don't I? Because it's post-impressionism. They didn't go black and white. So first of all, you've got to get the colour introduced. So on a separate layer, I'm colouring in with big brushes and such like, just all sorts of different colours, blurring them together and blending them together. But then using the colour blend mode allows the colour to come through, but the tone still to show. So that's always a good effect. And then beyond that, to create it, make it a little bit more sort of otherworldly, shall we say, I'm now using Crystallize as a little effect to break it up, and another one there using the same. That's in the end was my sort of finished article. But I have to say, you can keep going on and on and on with these things, and a lot of people, when they've looked at it, they say, well, actually, I quite like that one. Why have you gone any further? That didn't need to start going further and further into it. But, who knows? You don't know for sure, do you? But I quite enjoyed that. Another chap that you've heard of, Gauguin, there he is, sitting up on the right-hand side, self-portrait. And again, he's in that same sort of post-impressionist style, and again, strong, vibrant colours. So here we are up in Yorkshire, and I'm creating this sort of overly cooked colours. It's not the sort of photograph I'd ever put into a competition, but I'm just sort of talking you through the sorts of sort of learning process that I suppose I went through to get to this particular point. And a fairly conventional photograph of Pembroke College in Cambridge. Fortunately, I can get inside there because my sister-in-law is a professor there, so that was a chance to take that place. But then if you wanted to create a sort of post-impressionist feel, then on this occasion I'm using the dry brush effect, and sometimes you find you have to boost the saturation again after you've or the tones, just to get that brightness back into the picture. And here at Cirencester, again, that sort of feeling of post-impressionism that comes about using a plug-in filter called Buzz on this occasion. And it's not my the effect has come about using the plug-in, but the starting point was my photograph. And so same here, we're up in the Lake District at Wastwater Way. That's Wastdale, and again mainly dry brush, but once you've done some of these effects, you do need to work on the colour balance and the contrast to bring up the effect. So expressionism. Now, who have you heard of who's an expressionist? Well, actually, this chap here, Edvard Munch, is an expressionist painter, mainly in the early 1900s. And he was one of these people, and you recognise the Scream, of course, but these are one or two other examples of his work. And he was really quite troubled character, I think, because a lot of his work has sort of psychological, slightly disturbed-looking elements to it, as you know, with the Scream and so on, and other things that are sort of replicated regularly. As you look at the sky above his head in the middle there, and then you look at the light above the girl in the bottom left-hand corner. You know, these swirls, and then you come to the group of figures that are seemingly also on the same sort of pier that the Scream is being done. You see a very similar sort of picture of 3 or 4 figures, which I think are meant to be his family. And then in the distance you see the sort of the bay of the local town. So there are certain sort of things that are replicated regularly within so is an example here of my style of the Munch expressionist style, with the strong colours in the background and the rather worried-looking figure. But again, how does that come about? Well, actually, in Chichester, in the cathedral, you've got this bronze statue called the Refugee. So, I mean, you're photographing that, and of course there's a little bit of a plain background, but that's rather good, because that plain background adds an easy opportunity for you to select around it and to plop it into something else. So the next thing was I needed that background, a different background, and we wanted something with swirls along the lines that you see in the background of the Munch, of the Scream rather. So this bit of black and white background it doesn't matter that it's black and white at the moment, because it will be colourful eventually. Actually, this is a cabbage leaf. So I photographed the cabbage leaf, and then what I've done is I've zoomed it, or rather motion blurred it and zoomed it, two little effects on the same thing. And that gives you that sort of bit of background there. And then behind that, you add the colour and the sort of otherworldliness of the thing. Just to say that if you can look at, hopefully my mouse is showing you, all this area here is all very daylight sort of coloured, isn't it? In that that's how the original photograph was taken. But if you want your Munch to have a bit more atmosphere, you obviously don't want that daylight colour to be on the figure in the foreground, and especially as the space behind is all about the night and the stars and the movement and of the cosmos, as it were. So you've got to have that colour over that as well. So again, that's extra layers and blend modes and such like too. And fading up the opacity and down the opacity just to see what works and what doesn't. And another one in the style of lots of grain in this one, a photographic thing. And of course, that's like a non-anonymity that you get with just a tight crop on the young lady and the hair and the dress and so on. And of course, the red of the lips and the red of the dress sort of matching quite nicely. Another one where there's just a combination of 2 photographs. The figure in the foreground, he has that look of a Munch-like character, doesn't he, of being a little bit worried about life. Actually, the title for this one is The Look of Judas, because it did strike me that this chap has got that really very worried look as he's passing us, and he's looking over his shoulder, and then it felt religious. So again, I felt I needed to put some sort of background to it to give a context, I suppose, to the subject matter. And then another young lady, again in the style of Munch, shall we say, with these drapes half across her back and so on. A little bit like, Robert Damasky. I don't know if you know the work of the French photographer Damasky. But again, he sort of he created these sort of bromoil type images with strong contrasty light on the faces. It's a typical Robert Damasky as well, that is. A similar period of time of working, really. And again, you remember the girl standing, looking out across the water. So we've got the girl looking out through the window, and that same sort of look that the Scream has. The fact is, I don't even know if this is George Bernard Shaw, everybody. You probably knew that, but it's in the place called the Russell Coates Museum in Bournemouth, the Russell Coates Museum in Bournemouth, and they've got this bronze statue, and it struck me as perfectly looking as if he's as distressed as the Scream is in Monk's picture, and I just found a suitable sort of backdrop for it. But I also photographed it from the side, so let's have a look at that. And that's the same character, the same statue, photographed from the side. I'll put in the background. It hasn't quite worked so well yet, because really the coloration on the bronze isn't quite working. So it needed a little bit more of a sort of an oil painty effect, I think, and a little bit of that colour from the background to take away the daylight sort of effect from that. So, you think back to the Scream, and I think this has some very similar sort of feel to it in many respects. And, you think, so, well, but how has he done that? What's going on here? Because that is, again, two elements in the picture. The foreground here, this is a tree. And in fact, what was happening was in a little what's the word? Little woodland near to us, I came across this old tree with this great big knot hole in it, and I photographed that. And I had it for years. I never really used it. And then on another occasion, I got this photograph of the girl, and then what we've also done here is leave the girl without any effect across her, so she's lit in the middle of this. But added the sort of the swirls that you get with the Munch work. If you think back to Munch and the girl in the corner there, and the way the lines of the painting were going all around the sky of the Scream, and the other one with the family there, that same sort of swirly effect is in play in this particular effect. So the back, there's two pictures. The tree, you can just about see the bark of the tree here, can't you? And the sun shining on that bit there, and in this gap here there was as I say, just a bit of rotten wood, but it served a purpose to give me my expressionist style of photography. I don't think you can actually pigeonhole Van Gogh, because He had his own style, didn't he? He broke all the rules and boundaries. Rules of paint and composition were all different for him. But in Photoshop, there's a filter called oil paint. So we're at the Avebury Gardens again here, folks. Remember that dahlia? Well, this is another time that I took in this little kitchen garden. I taken that one and just given it that oil paint effect. And then I also, how Van Gogh likes to swirl things, doesn't he? And this is Liquify in Photoshop. Liquify, I think, is a bit over the top, actually. I think this is the one I prefer best, which is a little bit tighter, a close-up shot of the dahlias and the vegetation and so on, and then giving it that feeling from Van Gogh, as this one does. You think I've got this. It was a cornfield after a very windy day, and then I've added that sort of slightly oil paint. But then in the sky, I've created that sky with the Liquify tool. So I'm moving the sort of the tones around, and then of course dropping the windmill in. And of course you hear of Starry Night, don't you? Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. So we were up in the north of Norway once, and fantastic sky scenes, and now I've used the Liquify tool. So, for instance, up in the top right and left hand corner here, that is just using the Liquify tool with a brush of around that amount, and then just holding it at that place, and the whole thing just starts to swirl around you to give you that. And then you go over here and start again and do it with another swirl. And so it's because it's not everyone's cup of tea. But, here, for instance, we've got the conventional photograph tool almost, but it's had poster edges effect applied to it. So here I've gone out into the garden using daylight with these old sunflowers and photographed them. But then I've used the, after the photograph with poster edges, you applied the next layer, which is the sort of slightly oil paint one. And then because that needs to be brightened slightly, there's the one after it that's the finished article. So what happens is you start with that, which is quite bright and yellow, but once you apply that filter, it doesn't always stay as bright as it was. It slightly darkened it. So the next picture, you've got a little bit brighter. I hope you can see that, because it's quite important that you recognise the finished article doesn't necessarily come immediately. You sometimes have to look beyond, and then beyond again, and beyond again. Well, actually, this one, let me tell you, there's just one flower here in this picture, one sunflower, which was then copied and pasted, and the size of it was reduced, and it was sort of put onto layers behind each other. And of course, as it's going further away, it needs to get a bit smaller, and then the blue sky added in. So, the possibilities are endless. Wimpole Gardens in Hertfordshire, and multiple exposure, and it's quite impressionistic as well as having that sort of Van Gogh-like style. And then here's back to my dahlia. So the same dahlia, but with a different style effect to give the Van Gogh style. And this one here, I think maybe too much of swirl within it, but all the same, if you ever had to do a competition, the title was called Colour, this would be a perfect sort of shot to employ in that particular style. Well, now, I'm looking at the clock and it says 20 to 9, so on my clock here anyway. So we're going to go for about another 10 minutes, then we'll have a little bit of a break, okay? So just to give you some feeling that there is an end to all of this, folks. So anyway, here's Matisse, and he was a very long-lived character. And, he started off with this top left-hand corner. That's some of his early work. And then he got into Cubism as well. But he was very much a colourist. But in his later life, his eyesight was so poor, he started doing cutouts, like this one here, the cutout, and this one here on the bottom right. Do you know the title of this one on the bottom right? It's called The Snail. Can you see it? So it's just meant to be, it's like a little bit of a spiral of geometric shapes. But that's the way of that one. So let's press on. So here's my take on Matisse. Some of his early work, as I said, was much more like the post-impressionists and colorists, the Fauvists, and this particular one set in Copenhagen. This one in the Barbican, and again a little bit of a dry brush effect, and the girl and of course she has a French look about it because she's wearing a beret, doesn't she? That helps it along a little bit. And, yes, we went to France. We went to the Matisse Museum in Cadeau in Picardy. And I photographed this because I just quite like the motif. But it's not a very good photo. There's just someone looking at it. There was a reflection of the skylight above. So it didn't really work particularly well. But I then thought maybe I can make something of it. So that same motif, in the sort of style of Matisse, here we have it again. And again, but reduced. And so what's happening is we're on this line heading up here. We make it a little bit smaller to get the feeling of it being away. But at this point here, to make it as believable as possible, you actually invert it. So you've got a negative as opposed to the positives at the far end there, because it's up against black. It wouldn't show if it was up against white. And similarly, I then thought, well, actually, I'm not sure I like that one because there's too much the sort of tone within it. So I then had another go at it. And quite often, I have to say, not everybody likes these. They think it's gone, over the top. But I quite like the process, I suppose. And I do like AVs as well. So I can quite often slip some of these into AVs without actually using them as a print or a PDI in another competition. And, this is a straight shot, but it has that feel of France. Well, it's got the Eiffel Tower in for a start, hasn't it? And but do you remember the girl that was standing looking out to sea when I was looking at the monks? Well, she was. I took another photograph on another occasion or something like that, and created this sort of what I think is a very much 19th century picture of the in the style of Matisse. And you saw those cutouts a little earlier, didn't you? Well, this is my version of one of his cutouts. might call it the kiss. But how does that come about? Well, actually, I'm going to have to go on to, yeah, there we are. That's the original photograph. It's in Greenwich Market, and I just saw the statue, but I also liked the reflection. And that, for me, was what I was looking at. But when I was thinking about how one might create the Matisse, well, then oops, wrong way, was then thinking, well, maybe if I can create a line effect and refine that line effect and maybe add colour, I can then come up with something like that, which would be, as I say, in the style of the cutouts of Matisse. So that's the process. Now Cubism came along at the beginning of the 19th century as well, and Pablo Picasso, George Braque, Picasso. As I said at the very beginning, how can you do photographs like this? You can't really, because he's got his own particular style. You look at the weeping lady in the bottom left-hand corner there, or the sort of monumental figure of the girl top right. That's not going to happen. So actually, what I felt was I could do here was to photograph some of his work in a gallery, and he had a blue period, so I've applied a blue style, and the painting behind is also a Picasso on the wall at the back there. But that statue, I then looked at it in profile. So okay, it's not actually in the style of perhaps Picasso, but it's using Picasso's subject matter, and so this has got a really good title because it's called Passing Picasso. And I like the fact the girl knows I'm taking her picture, but she doesn't mind. She's smiling. And another one here. Well, I really do regret not having quite got the girl on the left-hand side into the picture, but I just like it so much that I'm willing to forsake that, because you can see the two of them really. It's called The Critics, and they're just looking at it and thinking about it, and I just think that's a lovely, lovely moment, catching those two together with their subject. And another one, we were in Tenerife, and at the shopping centre they were featuring lots of Picassos in the artwork, in the shop windows and so on. So again, and then when I suddenly looked at this, I got a picture of the girl there looking at me here, but also there's another one just at that point there. So I just added the girl in the middle to get all eyes on you. Now, George Braque. So here we go. So this is Cubism. He's reducing things to line and form, really. So it's called the violin. There's the violin, and that bit there, that's a picture. There's the handle there, the form of and there's the jug end, the top of the jug. This is a farm in a wood with a tree in front of it, a house with a tree in front of it. This is a harbour. There's a boat, and there's a mast. So, so here we go. I don't know if you're aware where this is. This is the River Thames. This is Cannon Street Station. And in Photoshop, in the art effects, you've got something called cutout. And you can posterize and limit the number of elements, and you can define the edge that you want. And then, here we've got that telephone box, or sort of the mobile phone building just there. And so how does that happen? Well, here's Brimham Rocks, and then using the cutout, it looks like that. Well, maybe that's become too abstract. I think probably that's just a step too far. But you've got all these sliders that you can work up and down to decide whether you like something or not. So the next one actually is a bit more what I think works. And in fact, I've just allowed some of the reality at the bottom to come through. So you can see the grass at the front of the rocks. But I think the rocks are more believable as Brimham Rocks, but in the Cubist style, when you see them like that. Or when you're in Helsinki and you see St. Nicholas's Cathedral and you apply that effect to the subject, I think that really looks fascinating as a building. And you begin to think, where is that? What's he done to that? How's he done that? And I haven't really done much. It's the computer that's done most of it. I just had to work on the effects and find the right picture to work with it, really. I mean, even something as simple as this, a little keyboard in the Cubist style. This is what we've got here. It's a keyboard, and yet all the lines, you think back to the violin. You knew there was a violin in that picture, but this has got a different feel to it. I really think there's so much potential in some of these. Well, you heard of Dadaism. I created something that said Dada all over it, and I used that, and I thought it was quite nice. But it's all created in Photoshop, the lettering, the text, the colour, the lines. So then I felt, could I find an artist who does this Dada? Well, Hannah Hock. She is a female artist of the period, and so this one here, for instance, says Marlene, and that's the legs of Marlene Dietrich. It's all cutouts and sort of postage, scrapbook type photography, really. But she is really the sort of the precursor to pop art. The work of Peter Blake and people like that, who did lots of cutouts and so on and created distortions of reality. And they often use these lettering in them. So I'm now looking at this to see where I can put in lettering. So you remember that first stitch, and then I put the picture of the girl. And this is at the time where there's been a lot of talk about gender identity and so on, hasn't it? So the title of this is Dada, Dadam or Eve. And that's just one commended in the Royal Photographic Society's Visual Arts Group exhibition, and it will be showing in the new year. So that one's done quite well recently. And another one where I'm sure this sort of appropriation of elements. So we've got 3 or 4 sort of things cut out and put into place, disparate things that don't really go together. But it needs something to sort of unify it as a Dada thing. So lo and behold, one of their motifs was life is not just here, but Dada. There. So then I've sort of covered it with all of these elements. And then life, the word life was there. So I've used something from Life magazine to sort of act as a backdrop to that. And here in Stockholm, just a combination of 2 elements, the buildings in Stockholm and the lettering from a poster. Paul Clay. Now I'm going to speed up a little bit because I think I'm running a little short, and it is now, it's 10 to 8, it's 10 to 9. So perhaps I ought to have a little break here, give you a moment to catch your breath. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to come back. Let's stop sharing so you can all see me, or I can see you rather. And I hope that I haven't babbled away too much, and that you got something out of it. Hopefully there was something for everybody within that first half. Thank you. And I mean, he's such an individualist, a particular character. He's been very influential with many other later painters like Rothko and some of the the abstract expressionists as well. His use of colour, fascinating. And so I then tried to do that. This is meant to be the Alps, folks. It's a Lake Geneva in the bottom, and then the mountains and the snow and the sky. But I don't think I really got it. But I found it was quite a difficult artist to replicate. But he did spend quite a lot of time in North Africa, in the Mediterranean area, and you might have go back to, there was 1 or 2 little images like this one in the bottom centre here, which is in Tunisia, and so I was looking to see if I could create these sort of field-like effects. You see these are meant to be sort of like fields going off into the distance. And so that sort of style. This is in Kefalonia. The sort of Lebanese cypress pines, fir trees, and then the distant scene, and 2 versions of it. One with that's the sort of photographic version actually, with grain from the original file, and then that one is the one that's sort of slightly limited tonal range within it, making it a little bit more painterly, but I think a little bit more effective in the style of him. But again, the colours are meant to be enhanced to get that impression. And I'm not sure about whether this one works. This is in Cuba, and I have a feeling to a certain extent it's not quite in the style of him, but it does have this sort of repetition of form and shape, as does this one, which was in a style that he seemed to be espousing a little earlier in those examples. Now this one, Futurism, a short-lived period of artwork that sort of was all about movement. So, two little examples down here. To me, that looks a little bit like the Mallard train or something heading. There are the wheels of the car or the train, and it's heading round the corner and swirling towards you. But it's just an impression of movement and shape, rather than something fairly distinct. But this one up here, I love the sort of the replication of the wheels and the use of lettering to help it along. And so I was looking again for examples of this, and this one's a straight shot. So it's actually a bicycle rushing past me, and I just photograph. And of course it's going so quickly that it just registers as a blur, and the way the spokes on the wheel are sort of rendered is something that you wouldn't be able to get without using your camera to record the speed of it going by. And similarly here, this chap was on the Brighton Run a few years ago, and I photographed him, and I thought, well, can I create something along the lines of that one we saw with the bicycle a moment ago, with lettering in the background and these wheels that have got sort of 3 or 4 elements to them, and they have that sort of slight sort of rectilinear, sort of octagonal sort of edge to them, or whatever you think. And so it says A23 because that's the road to Brighton. Method in my madness. Multiple exposure, again, to try and get that feeling of the futuristic style, and this Jaguar in a Coventry Transport Museum, multiple exposures. Similarly here, the chassis of a Hillman of some sort. And you see, even here with they had this exhibit of sort of Victorian bone shakers and penny farthings and so on. So there's probably 5 images there overlaid to give this feeling of the speed of the futuristic artists at that period. Or even on this occasion, again, I talked about camera blur and movement. So I'm just moving the camera. You can't see me. I'm trying to sort of do it in front of you. But I mean, I just a sweep of the camera across the scene, not up and down like I was with the trees at the very beginning, but across the scene, to get that sort of feeling of blend and movement. And another one, again, how do you replicate this without just copying shapes and patterns and put them on there? But interesting, his use of colour was really what was most important about Kandinsky. The title of this one, bottom left, is called Deluge. I don't know, I can't quite see it, but, maybe there's something you all can see in it, but not a particularly exciting title. This one, top right, is called On Cream, and this one in the middle is called On White, and you can see it's beginning to move towards the sort of surrealist work, like a bit like Miro, where you're using these isomorphic forms, and so within the sort of realms of the camera, what can you do? Well, actually, this is a bit of a motion blur effect on a steel building with reflections of another building in the background. Or here, putting these little elements together, it's meant to be water at the bottom, cliffs at the top, and fields. Well, anyway, let's press on to something a bit more obvious. Constructivism, a Russian form that came about after the First World War and around that period. And this is one character, Malevich, and again, a good title, isn't it? Yellow, orange and green. But actually, in Photoshop, you could make your own version of yellow, orange and green if you wanted to. But I don't know that that's particularly creative, because all I've done is copy it. So, I've placed different layers in front or behind each other. I've added a little bit of texture at the background. But I think that's probably being a little bit of a plagiarist, really, to do it in that way. So if you can find ceiling shapes like these were and overlay 3 or 4 of them together, you get that sort of, and then maybe add a bit of colour if you wanted to, you get these sort of feelings of the constructivist style. Now, one of the chaps who was instrumental in this era was Gaum, and he created these heads, made them in a variety of materials, but on this occasion I photographed this one in Dallas Art Museum. The ceiling here, that's a ceiling, that's in the Eden project, and you might just pick up the Hayward Gallery in part here, there, and there, and all of these little sort of rectilinear elements are put together, and that's called the art of constructivism, and that's won me 1 or 2 little certificates over the years. So if you find something that works, then I would say milk it. So, you might not like that one, but I mean, that's the same sort of idea of including the subject matter. Or on this occasion, at Duxford, the War Museum, Duxford Museum, this was a radar structure here, all this metalwork, and then the figure is Iron Man in there, So the options and the opportunities are brilliant. So, this is another person who was in the constructivist period. So there's my version. So if you look back to the middle of this previous page, there's her style. Well, this one isn't quite a pure copy because I've just done my variation where she's using gradients and shapes and line effects and little details that to make it work. But then she took it a little bit further in her work by including faces in that same sort of broken up style. So that's the starting point. Actually, they're the wrong way round. I should switch them in the talk really. So we've got this one here, which was the starting point, and then going back to it, that was the one where I've just reduced the colour, so it's more of a monochromatic finish on that one. And then this one again, using those overlays, finding this very highly impasto portrait in an art gallery somewhere. But of course, then you can see, look there, adding the eyes. So trying to create something a little bit beyond the original, so that you're adding your own sort of impact to it. So here's Mondrian. Now we all recognise his work, don't we? Because it's all about line and form and colour. So it'd have titles like red, black on yellow and orange or something. But this one up here, bottom right, that's called New York. That one up there is called Boogie Woogie Broadway. And that was done in about the 40s. These were done in the 20s, and in the early 1900s, there was this one. So, you think, interesting character. Where's he getting all these ideas from? Well, I don't know that copying Mondrian was the obvious way of doing things, but when we were in Melbourne, this is the Channel 7 studios, and they've got that sort of Mondrian look about them, haven't they? And in Lille, these tower block had got the Mondrian look about it. So these are straight shots, but I think in the style of Mondrian. This one, though, I think it's pretty obviously tower block. Whereas if you turn it on its side, I think it becomes more abstract and more art-like. So that's my preferred view for this particular photograph, because it slightly switches the reality of what we saw in the previous picture. But you might do this sort of thing. This is I think, sort of Mondrian-like. It's using a 5-image multiple exposure in Birmingham. And of course it's the buildings, the lines of the buildings that give you that sort of rectilinear Mondrian-like shape. Or here in Lille, again, using this reflection of the Beaux-Arts Museum in the window there. But here at the Tate Britain, a few months ago, there was an exhibition of Mondrian's work. We went to look at it, and you might think, well, how did he get these strange swirls in the ceiling here? Well, actually, I'm sitting in the wheelchair, and I'm rotating. I'm turning the camera around as I'm taking the picture. So that's given me a nice clean line. And then, actually, because what I had to do was to put that in there to make that finish off the picture. Because it didn't quite work right when it was just, because I wanted yellow to go to yellow and red to go to red. So I needed to have the right image in the right place. But the sky, or rather the ceiling and the floor, are the distorted bit. They're sort of like a Mondrian, but moving it on to my sort of style. But you think of Mondrian as purely line and form, but look, these two paintings are both by him in his earlier years, and they're brilliant. You look at the detail and the sort of the quality of the work is fantastic. And then he moved on to these line pictures. Well, I mean, this is my multiple exposure version of it, and this is my camera motion blur version of it, because in the end, you don't want to be entirely copying someone's work, do you?